So, hello, thanks for coming to my talk. My name is Einar, and I'm very happy for this opportunity to be here to talk about some of my favorite topics, which is domain-driven design, hypermedia, and evolving architectures. That's pretty great. I'm going to do so in the context of my day job. So NRK TV is where I work. NRK is the public broadcaster in Norway, and NRK TV is our TV streaming service. So basically, what we deliver is something like this. So if you're a Norwegian and you want to watch Norwegian TV programming, you can do so online using your browser, your mobile phone, your tablet, your smart TV, all those kinds of things. Yeah. Now, I probably don't have to convince you why using domain-driven design is a good idea for evolving architecture. I might have to sell you on the hypermedia bit, so I'm going to try to do that. So why am I going to talk about hypermedia? Is it because it's in vogue? Is it because it's popular? Well, it's not, so that can't be the reason. Is it because I like it then? Well, I do, but that's more relevant for like a hobby project than for like serious enterprise software. Yeah, so I meant to make the case that we are a service that a lot of Norwegians use. I mean, we have like 500,000 users watching roughly 500,000 hours of content every day. So it is a serious software system. Right, so no, it's not because I like it. It's because it helps us evolve architecture, which is the topic of this talk. So I want to talk about hypermedia in the context of being an enabler for better architecture. So this is an architecture talk, and it's also what you could call a real-world talk, because it's how we apply it in our job. So in fact, an alternative title for this talk might be Strangling the Monolith Using Hypermedia. So the agenda for my talk, first I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the real-world architecture challenges that we face at NRK TV. Then I'd like to do a short introduction to hypermedia, and then show some practical hypermedia work that we've done at NRK TV. And I hope by the end of the talk I'll have convinced you that hypermedia is really about architecture. It's not about like fancy ivory tower idea or anything like that. I'll also say that I'm not going to talk about the rest as such. I'm just going to talk about hypermedia. Okay. So those architecture concerns at NRK TV, I'd like to start, because we're DDD Europe, in a socio-technical context. In fact, I'd like to start with sort of a business perspective on our architecture problems. We're working in a rapidly evolving domain. I mean, TV streaming is a pretty competitive area. So we must stay competitive. We have some formidable competitors. It used to be that we competed with other broadcasters in Norway. Now we also compete with YouTube and Netflix and stuff like that. So yeah, we must stay nimble. And in terms of organization, we're working on multiple teams at NRK TV, where I work. We also do a lot of collaboration with NRK Radio and also NRK Super, which is the children's offering that we have, so tailored to children. And in addition to that, we also have, obviously, lots of interactions with other parts of the organizations as well, in particular, production system, planning systems, legal departments, what have you. But I'm sort of going to gloss over that because already we're getting into a too complex picture. So I'm going to pretend that NRK TV lives in a vacuum, and it doesn't. We're a system in a system of systems, but we're going to focus on sort of the NRK TV part of that system. That's complex enough. Right, so we must support autonomy for these multiple teams working at NRK TV. We must enable those teams to do experiments, try out new things. We must support change, and at the same time, we must provide stability. That's already a challenge. It gets worse. We must improve the stability that we have every year, because as linear broadcast is declining, TV streaming online services become more important. So we take on some of that responsibility for having a high uptime, right? So as a public broadcaster, in a case of national crisis, we must be up to sort of tell the public what has happened. And that now includes also the online services. And so from a technical perspective, I'm going to talk about the player API, which is what I'm working on, which serves metadata and manifests to all those different clients that people use to watch television. Right. And there are a bunch of different kinds of clients. So you have your laptops, your mobile phone, your smart TV, and you could roughly, I think, group those into two categories. You have sort of your progressive clients, like our web browser client, which basically deploys every day tries out new features. Also, like the latest iOS mobile phone, this progressive client deploys a lot, stuff like that. And then on the other hand, you also have like legacy clients, which might be a client running on an old smart TV that doesn't really get updated that often. So they had radically different deployment cycles. And obviously, this has an impact on architecture, right? We must account for this. So I'd like to take you some years back in time. It's getting on 4 years now. And at that point in time, we had a monolithic web API serving all those clients. It was running in Azure on 2 data centers for redundancy. It was backed by a relational database. And it had a bunch of supporting worker jobs that would sort of pre-process some data that it could serve up to clients. And it employed some cunning caching schemes to sort of make everything go around, right? And that was working. I mean, in the sense that software works, sort of. But the complexity was kind of overwhelming. So as a new programmer coming into this project and trying to contribute and implement new things without breaking old things was kind of a tough challenge. It was largely unreasonable in both senses of the word. So you couldn't really reason about it, and it was unreasonable that it was that complex. The failure modes were very complex. Effects of change were hard to predict. And as a consequence of all that, of course, we had bugs, right? And when you have bugs and you don't know when or why you're going to introduce bugs, you get fear of change. And that leads to stagnation, which is not what we want, right? And to make everything sort of go around, we relied on what I'd like to call a release manager genius. We had this one person who sort of could predict the interactions between different kinds of changes to our system. And he did an awesome job, right? He was very good at that. But at the same time, it's kind of a risky situation to be in, right? So what do you do then in this situation? Should we rewrite our API? What do you mean rewrite? We have 500,000 users every day, right? We can't rewrite this thing. And also, the competition is not going to stop for like 3 years and then we're all going to rewrite things. So we can't rewrite. So how do we rewrite? So we must evolve into whatever rewriting we want to achieve, right? But I think before we can sort of even try to do that, we need to consider where did our old monolith come from? Why did we end up in this situation that we're in? And I'm going to try to, like a bold statement here, and say that the reason is the entity. I'm going to argue that the entity is the monolith itself, because the entity is what snowballs complexity. It sucks up all the complexity of all the various domains that you're in. So the entity is the big ball of mud. Now, of course, the entity is an abstract thing. For NRK TV, the entity is the TV show. And I think maybe if you're not convinced that I'm correct in saying this, I'd like to introduce you to, let's see. Can I do this? Oh well. let's take a look at the entity. This is the entity. Oh, you can't see it. That's kind of unfortunate. Let's see, can I drag it somewhere? Maybe. Yes, here it is. This is the entity. I don't know if you can read this. And I don't know if I can zoom in, but there are, let's see, I'm going to try to zoom in. Let's see what we have here. Well, we have some favorites here, and you have some URLs, and then you have some images, and you have, well, I don't know. You have a bunch of stuff, right? You have usage rights, you have contributors, so there's metadata, there's transmissions channels, reviews, legal age categories, titles, a lot of titles. There's a title, an original title, and other titles. Okay. So this is our big ball of mud. And let's see. Yes. So you might draw sort of a simplified version of this entity, something like this. And these are all sort of valid aspects that relate to the TV show in some way, right? So it looks kind of silly in that that picture I showed you, but at the same time, these are all important things to us, right? So what then is a TV show? So that's an interesting question because the answer depends on who's asking it, right? And this offers us an angle to do functional decomposition, right? So we can think of this TV show in a various contexts. And this is where the DDD things come in, right? So if you can try to identify bounded context, maybe we don't have to think about all those things at the same time. So it would be preferable to, for instance, look at the TV show just in a, what you might call an on-demand catalog context, right? So here's a TV program, or a TV show in the catalog context. This is the TV show Zombie Lars, which is about a kid zombie going to school. And you can see some metadata about the program. So you have 3 seasons of this, some extra material. You have here's 9 episodes in season 3. You have a description, and well, age limit, duration, stuff like that. All sort of things that are metadata, but not really related to the stream itself. So there you have complexity with respect to describing the media content. And an interesting question in the catalog context might be, what kinds of TV shows are there? And how should they be presented? What's their logic? Because we have a lot of different kinds of TV series. So a TV series with episodes like Zombie Lars is different from the daily news, is different from a sports event, is different from a talk show, is different from a documentary, and so forth. And this is important in the catalog context because consumers like to consume that kind of content differently, right? So you might want to binge watch Zombie Lars, you're not going to binge watch the daily news, probably. Whereas in the playback context, things are different. They're obviously related, but they're different. Right? So this is now the playback context. So this is related to actually watching the content. Right? So here you're interested in how far I've seen, and here you have some accessibility versions, and you can turn on and off subtitles and stuff like that. And in this context, you have a lot of complexity. Some of it is kind of obvious, some of it is more hidden, but it's related to playing the actual media content. So you have to worry about support for various kinds of media manifests supported by different devices. You're interested in streaming quality, adaptive bit rates, and supporting accessibility versions that I said. So those are 2 contexts. What about others? Well, here's a sort of crude simplification of our attempt to sort of break down in some contexts or some different lenses that we might want to apply when talking about TV shows. You have the catalog and the playback, as I talked about. You have the editorial desking, recommendation systems, personalization, and search. And the reason for doing this is to try to contain, well, one of the reasons is to try to contain complexity. But it's also about trying to identify and exploit different goals and requirements across contexts. And so if you look at this, if we think of something like criticality, well, what's the most critical part of this service? Well, if you come to our service and you can't watch TV, then you're sort of dead, right? There's not much you can do. I mean, you can browse the catalog, but you want to watch it. And then you have sort of these other contexts that you might use in order to identify what you want to see. That's kind of important too. Whereas these recommendations and personalization stuff, like how far you progressed in watching a TV show across various devices and so forth, that's more like a nice optional thing, right? If that goes down, it might be annoying, but it's not terrible. But if you sort of keep everything in one bag, then everything is equally critical, right? And if you want redundancy to ensure that playback doesn't go down, then you have to have redundancy for all the other things as well. What about caching? So we're in a lucky situation in a way because we do almost exclusively reads. There's very little writes in our system. But for personalization, we do writes because we want to see what you've seen, how far you've seen it, and so forth. So that's not terribly cacheable. These other things are kind of cacheable. This is not so cacheable because we do have a multi-CDN solution that sort of resolves the URL that you're going to actually use when watching your TV show. But apart from that, mostly highly cacheable. If you mix everything together, none of it is cacheable. What about failures? Say if your like machine learning backed recommendations go down. If everything is mixed together, then everything goes down. So we were in a place where everything was uniformly critical, not easily cacheable. That's why we have these cunning caching schemes to try to sort of mitigate that. We also was in a situation where we had no partial success. And if you, well, that's kind of bad, right? And it's prone to fail hard then. And it's hard to reason about, so what to do? Well, what we wanted to do is to start doing some deliberate architecture work, right? Because we had identified these problems and we wanted to fix them. So we actually lobbied for and got ourselves an architect, an actual architect. And the purpose of having an architect is not to have someone to sort of dictate how everything is going to work across contexts. It's about having someone to make sure that the right conversations are being held and the right questions are being asked, right? To facilitate communication. We started using bounded context, or our attempts at identifying bounded contexts, as service boundaries. And when we wrote new stuff, we introduced it as new services respecting these boundaries. And as a technical measure, we introduced also an API gateway as what you could call an architecture seam. So we have Varnish and Nginx in front of our API. And this offers us some leeway because we can now sort of route things to different solutions and still present a single front to the clients. And when you have this in place, you can start using the strangler pattern, which means that you can sort of start introducing new services that gradually take over responsibilities from other parts of the system that you want to phase out. And then we started experimenting with hypermedia. And why is hypermedia important in this story? Well, once you've done this functional decomposition, you've sort of broken things apart, you want to recompose it again, because the client, and in particular the end user, doesn't really care about your nice decomposition. They want sort of a coherent story, right? So we use hypermedia to sort of tie these things back together and to allow clients to navigate seamlessly across these boundaries that we've introduced, produce this integrated experience. Okay, so this is all very good, very good. So now let's talk about hypermedia. What is hypermedia? And hypermedia is a very simple idea. Again, I'm not going to talk about REST. I'm not going to talk about the state transfer at all. So hypermedia is just media with links. That's sounds like a very small thing, right? And it is. Those links have semantics, and those semantics are important, right? So they're there for a reason. So we use link relations to express those semantics. So it's sort of the link relations now describe the relationship between whatever resource you're at and whatever resource you're going to. See, link relations, yes. Link presence is dynamic and meaningful, right? So if a link is there, it's because it's a reasonable next step to do for a client. And if it's not a reasonable next step, then the link is not going to be there. The purpose of links, for us at least, is to turn resources into junctions, right? So they sort of offer the clients reasonable things to do next. Yeah, just to sort of hammer it in, links answer the question, now what? Now what should I do as a client? So there should be a link in all our responses for each way forward, or each reasonable way forward for a client. And the nice thing about this is that these links then connect resources to form coherent narratives. Because like clients and in particular end users don't really care about endpoints as such. They want to achieve goals, right? So here I've drawn resources or endpoints, what you want to call it. This is sort of an abstract representation of our API. And again, the API is kind of large-ish, so I'm going to use a simplified version of it here. And these resources now are connected with these links that I was talking about, right? To sort of tell how everything fits together in order to achieve some goal. Now, again, it's going to be a simplified version. Usually these resources are going to have some supporting links as well for like resources like images and stuff like that. I'm going to omit that because it just clutters the diagrams. So you could call this a model for the API, right? So it's going to lie a bit. Right, so I drew all these links, but again, this image is kind of misleading because it's all just potential links, right? They're not necessarily there. They're not statically there. If they are there, it's because the state of the application is such that it makes sense to use those links. Now, say something interesting happens on the top here. I tried to make that one yellow, so maybe that's playback. Like maybe that's play the actual video. And maybe the client starts out here, like the end user is trying to browse some content. And then there are two options for what to do next. You could go there, you could go there. And maybe in this case, the client chooses to go there, and then you have some other options, right? And then the client chooses to go there, but for whatever reason, the application now is in a state that it doesn't make sense to present that link. So we're not going to give that link out. So what the client's going to do, well, go straight to the interesting part in this case, and then sort of the goal is achieved, right? So the narrative ends there. So that's one way to sort of achieve the goal of playing video. Now there are other options, right? So the client, you could start by going there instead, and then you could go there, maybe go there, and then you end up playing the video, and again, you achieved your goal, but this time through a different route, using different resources. Now, this means that in a sense, you have a redundancy here, right? So if you want to reach that goal, you can either go through there, or you can go through there. What does that mean? It means that if you're in a situation where for whatever reason this service is down, it's not answering, so you get a 500 something error, you don't have to give up, right? The client doesn't have to give up. You can still offer a path for the end user to achieve their goal, even though it wasn't their preferable way. You still have this sort of fallback solution by using the other path. Now, as a concrete example, in order to play video, maybe you start at the front page and then say, oh, this looks interesting. I'm going to click there now and go to that show, and then I'm going to start playing it. That's one way. Another way is just to do a quick search for the name of the program you want to see. And a final one might be to just open a link that someone shared with you. So we have all these different kinds of ways to navigate to that goal. Now, so in terms of these colors I tried to use for redundancy, well, these are all look the same now. These are a bit more critical, or these are more critical than these ones, because these are sort of optional, right? They're not needed in order to reach the goal. Now, I've been drawing these individual resources, but the nice thing about graphs is they can represent multiple things, right? So it also sort of scales up to more like a bounded context level, right? So this is a simplified graph now, showing these different contexts. So you have our desking context, catalog context, playback context. And it nests nicely, so you can sort of group these different kinds of resources within these contexts. And again, these hypermedia links tie together the different contexts in order to form narratives. And this is interesting, I think, when we talk about evolution and versioning of APIs. Right? So when people talk about versioning of APIs, the classical question is, well, which versioning scheme should we use? Should we version in the URLs? Should we do content negotiation? That sounds more hypermedia-like, maybe we should do that. Our experience has been that it's not so relevant as you might think, or at least not for us. Because for us, it's rarely useful to replace individual endpoints, right? So I'm going to take this one out now and replace it with a slightly better one. Instead, we'd like to try to offer new and improved narratives for the clients, right? And then we use these links to offer the new alternatives to the clients. And we identify these different narratives using link relations, right? And then you let the client opt into the new alternative. So you offer both, right? You offer the old solution and the new solution, and then you're sort of, well, then you can track which clients uses which narratives. The clients all self-identify through the user agent header, so we know which clients use which narratives. And then you can eventually, if it's needed, you can remove links to the obsolete narratives once all the clients are over. And this is nice because, as I said, we have clients that have sort of wildly varying deployment rates. Some deploy every day, some deploy maybe 4 times a year. Some maybe don't deploy anymore. That's kind of important then that they can choose the new narrative at their own leisure. Right. So as an example, let's consider this situation here of the API. Maybe we determine that, okay, we're not really happy with the catalog narrative, right? So now the old catalog narrative, we label it as the legacy catalog now. And there are 3 ways you can reach this context: through this series relation from desking and personalization, or through the episode relation from the playback context. Now say we want to replace this with these new fancy TV show pages instead, right? This is made up now with more resources than what we had here, that's fine. It's just a way to tell a story to the client. And then we can sort of link these in, right? You can link through the show page relation now from these contexts. And from the playback context, you can reach the same context using the program page. So we offer, in this case, both of these links, right, to the clients. And then the clients choose which one they want. And obviously, when you start out, no one is using the new narrative. But then you can sort of start slowly phasing it in, right? Maybe one of the progressive clients, maybe hidden behind a feature flag, something like that, starts using this new story, right? And then gradually the other, maybe the mobile phones get along, or maybe one of the smart TVs starts using it. And then slowly the old story sort of fades away, right? This is the strangler pattern in practice. And it might be that you stay for a very long time, something like this, right? If you have like an old smart TV client that's never getting updated anymore, they're basically not going to turn that off. Or you might be able to turn it off completely. That's nice if you can. Now, in terms of hypermedia format, what we've been using at NRK is something called HAL, Hypermedia Application Language. The reason for choosing HAL is that it's lightweight. So you start with basically your JSON document, and that's a HAL document. What it offers is sort of a structured way to add links to that. And it allows you to do sort of gradual, add these links gradually, right? Which is important to us because we're changing these things as we go. Now resources then have links and they have state. These links have a target, which is the URL, and they have this link relationship, which expresses the semantics. The resources may have embedded resources in them. That's useful in some cases. It's not crucial. But I'd like to show you some examples to make this more concrete. All of these examples are greatly simplified because they need to fit on the slide. But this is a sort of a very simple HAL document. So it's JSON. In HAL, you put your links in this _links property, and then you have you sort of have to follow a pattern of properties for any given link. In this case, it's the self link, which points back to the resource itself, for apparently the TV series Scum. So you have this collection of links, you have the link relation, the target is there, and then the URL itself. It's a different example. Here you have the link collection, you have the link relations, you have the self pointing back to itself, and you also have these playback manifests. And in HAL you can have either one link or you can have an array of links. That's fine as well. When you have an array of links, you can differentiate using name as a sort of secondary key. In this case, this is sort of the default manifest. This is one of the accessibility versions that we offer to the clients. Another example, a collection of links, link relations. In this case, we have a templated link where the client can sort of put in some data to complete the link. In this case, sort of a user ID or user hash or something like that. You can embed resources, that's what I said. If you do, you have a link relation which expresses the relationship now to this embedded resource, and then you have either a complete representation of the resource or a simplified one in here. In this case, it's a very simple one, which says, okay, this is the favorite. This self here points back to the self of the favorite resource, not the sort of parent resource that has the embedded resource. Again, maybe some concrete examples would be helpful. So this is the desking context. Maybe this is sort of a part of the front page, right? So here we have some different kind of content you might want to see. So you have here now, okay, here you have a series resource for this one, which points to representation here that offers you the ability to go to the catalog context. And if you do, you end up here. Now you're in the catalog context of that same TV show. And here you have an embedded episode resource with a bunch of links. You can go to the playback context to actually watch the stream. You have a legacy playback option here, which is sort of one of these old narratives that we still support for some of the clients. And you have the ability, a templated link. I don't know what it's templated. Well, yeah, share a link to the episode. So you go to the playback context to actually watch the show. Now here, this thing here with the accessibility versions, this is powered by the accessibility manifest links, right? So if you have something more than the default manifest, we're going to offer that as options here, right? Right, so yes, this is now this scenes talk, which ends up here as an option for playback, right? If you want the accessibility version. That's the accessibility option, and you have links to play the next episode. If you want to skip ahead, you can go back to the catalog context, and then you can the client can report viewing progress using this URL, right? Okay, so that was sort of 4 years of evolution in half an hour, something like that. The situation today is that the monolith is shrinking. We don't have our genius anymore. He's doing something else. He's being a genius somewhere else. We have a lot more independent deploys. So we don't stop and ask someone if you can deploy, basically. We use, instead of these cunning caching schemes, we use plain old HTTP caching. Works remarkably well. And it's not that hard to reason about. All our new resources use these links. And we have retrofitted links on many of the old resources as well. We've phased in several new services, so a new solution for playback, which is the entire playback context. We have these new TV show pages that I showed in the example, and we have an entirely new solution for personalization, which uses Microsoft Orleans actor framework, kind of a cool subsystem within the larger system, right? And yeah, let's see. To summarize then, I hope to convince you that domain-driven design and hypermedia is a good match. What we've been doing is that we've tried to use bounded context to conquer complexity, conquer and contain complexity. We have been using links to evolve our API and to form these narratives. And obviously, we continue to evolve because architecture is never done, which is both good news and bad news, I think. It makes it fun. And that's basically all I have. I think we actually have time for some questions, if there are any. Oh, there are some. Yes. Is there a mic for? Yes.
Do you provide any form of documentation for the clients in some form?
Yes. That's a very good question. So the question was, do we provide documentation for the clients? Yes. So we use OpenAPI to document all our resources. We don't generate it, we handwrite it, because we find that yields better contracts. And we also collaborate a lot with the clients on how to actually shape those contracts. Yes. Is that an answer?
Yes. Do you provide any client libraries?
Provide client libraries. We don't. Yeah, no, is the answer to that. We do collaborate quite closely with the clients, so, but that's yes.
Well, can you hear me? Yeah, I guess so. As far as I know, OpenAPI doesn't have anything about hypermedia. So the question is about link semantics. How do you make clients aware about new semantics? How do you share those relationships so that clients become aware?
Yes, so yeah, since you have the mic, I suppose people here, I don't have to repeat the question. That's a good question. I think the answer is, so we don't have a formal specification then for the link semantics. We rely on talking to the clients and explaining what the link relations are, basically. We can write, obviously, prose in the OpenAPI contracts, and we do that, but apart from that, it's a collaboration thing. So we don't work in the way that we sort of, the backend produces a new version of the API and then dumps it to the clients. It's a collaborative effort, so they're aware of these new things. But yeah. It's not formally specified. More questions?
You talk about narratives.
Yes.
Do you design new features as additional narratives? So a producer comes and says, we need a new narrative, instead of we need a new feature?
I think narrative is probably mostly my term. I'm not sure if that's the language that other people use. Well, the way that we do new features is, I mean, that's a strategic thing, right? So it involves the product owner, and then the user experience people, and then clients, and then us. So, but that's a sort of collaborative thing again. So, but no, our product owner doesn't use the term narrative. No.
Would you prefer him to use it? Sounds like a reasonable way to explain things, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe, I'm not sure. I think I find it helpful to think in narratives when designing the API. So maybe that's a little bit low level for the product owner to think in those terms. I like to share that way of thinking at least with the clients, though, right? So they also think not in individual endpoints that you can sort of grab data from, but more in sort of an integrated story. But if you call that narratives or user story, well, yes.
From the moment you decided to do DDD,
Yes.
until the time that you started actually putting it in action, how much time did you need, and was there a specific challenge in it?
That's a good question. Now I had to think back, and my memory is lousy. Well, I started at NRK TV roughly 4 years ago, so basically when this process was starting. So me and some friends were starting with sort of this DDD initiative. I think we just sort of started, I think we attacked it bottom up and top down in some sense. We started using it just when talking and discussing solutions between the developers. And then we also, it was the job of a poor elected architect to sort of explain to the product owner what we were doing and why we were doing it. And luckily we have a product owner that listens to people. So it wasn't, I don't think, either he did a really good job and sheltered everything of that from me, or it wasn't that hard to sell. So yeah. But I mean, I think we just started using it immediately, in a sense, when we got on board at NRK TV. Yes.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for this presentation. Given your actual architecture, have you considered using GraphQL instead of hypermedia everywhere?
Yes. So have we considered using GraphQL? We have. And how can I say this? Well, we want to. One thing is that we want to provide these narratives, right? So, and I think. I don't have much experience with GraphQL myself, but I like the way that hypermedia sort of ties this together to form narratives. In my head, sort of GraphQL is, well, this might be a bit flippant, but in a sense, it's like giving the clients the key to your house and then leaving, in a sense, which might be a reasonable thing to do in some sense, in some context at least. We want to use HTTP caching as much as we can, so we don't want to sort of invent our own caching scheme on top of that. At the same time, if a client decided to create like a backend for frontend using GraphQL on top of our API, that would be fine if they want to do that. So, I mean, team autonomy and stuff like that. But I think we might have done GraphQL. Maybe it would have been good for us. I think it would have been a very big change and a costly change to the existing API, whereas this is sort of has been very easy to retrofit in a sense. We just add some stuff without changing fundamentally how the API works.
Maybe
Yeah.
you couldn't have been following path dynamically with GraphQL.
Sorry?
Maybe you could not have been following path dynamically with GraphQL, I think.
Oh, okay, right. So again, I'm not a GraphQL expert either, so yeah, there might be options that I'm not really aware of that could have worked nicely. Yes.
Thank you.
I think probably last question so that people can have a break. But
Okay,
yes, go ahead.
just, last question. During your talk, when we were traveling in the narratives and the resources, you mentioned several times the state of the application.
Yes.
So I presume the state of the application is actually in the client's application. You're not talking about the state of the application as something which is stored in the server, or
Yeah.
there are trade-offs, or
Right. So we don't really, when I talk about state of the application, it's mostly state related to the resources, such as are user rights valid now? So is it okay for a client to actually view this content now, because we have restrictions on when something becomes available. Right? Very simple example is for live events. So you can't really start watching the stream before it starts. So that's one part of the state in that sense. But apart from that, it's largely stateless on the server side. Yes. Is that an answer to the question, or did I answer something else?
Yes. No, thank you.
Yes. So I think we're out of time. Thanks for coming.